Hey, deserving listeners, a week or two ago, I published a video analyzing the public apology from the public figure named Colleen Balinger. And sometimes when I make a video like this, I think that I should also publish to the audio feed. It doesn't happen very often, but occasionally it does. And so I thought I would do that here. If you don't know who Colleen Balinger is, she is an entertainer on YouTube and in live shows like on stage and whatnot, and on social media. She is an entertainer for what seems to be her main audience is young people, like middle school age kids or high school age kids, and she is kind of a clown. If you just Google her and look up, and I mean clown in, I suppose, the positive way, where she will dress up in odd clothes. She's kind of like a modern day clown. Like she puts on her lipstick in this very uneven way. She has very uneven makeup and hair and outfits. Not all the time. Sometimes she just is wearing standard outfits and whatnot. But she is a silly person, but she, she's not employed by some production company, it seems. She's just a person who decided to become big. In the old days, you had people like in Seattle, we had J.B. Patches, but I guess more broadly, you would have people like Pee Wee Herman or something. And these are figures that we loved, and Mr. Rogers and whatnot. And the thing that is not necessarily the case anymore is back then you would have a whole production team that would be corralling these performers, for better or for worse, right? Meaning that if Pee Wee Herman, if the actor Paul Rubens, if he decided that he wanted to do something a little beyond the standard, the standards of entertainment at the time for kids, then the producers, the directors, and maybe even the FCC, the government, would actually say, no, you can't publish that. Whereas today, the vast majority of content providers for children are completely unregulated, and what we're hoping is that YouTube will regulate these folks, but they typically do not. So my impression is that YouTube does not want to get into the business of having to spend billions of dollars monitoring and responding to all these complaints. Of course, they have some standard, but I think that they don't want to put the message out there that is their job. Maybe they're hoping another agency, I don't know. I guess the more cynical view, which is probably the accurate view, is that YouTube makes a lot more money when they're unregulated. So they make money from the content, and there's a lot of advertisers that will put ads in those things. Anyway, so Colleen Balinger, seemingly, from my understanding, was one of those unregulated content providers that was providing a lot of entertainment that if you just watch like her full catalog, a lot of her entertainment was pretty standard stuff that you would see on television back in the old days or even today. But because she's unregulated and she's seemingly making content 24/7, the way that these kind of content providers are, I'm kind of in that category to some extent. It's weird. A peek behind the curtain is that when you are a content provider like myself, there's never enough time in the day to make all the content that the fans want and are asking for. So there's that. Also, there's not enough time in the day or I should say, for every minute of content that one provides as a content provider, that makes you money. I mean, it's not like 1 minute equals X amount of pennies or something, but the more content you make, the more money you make. And when you have, that incentive, and you have fans that are asking for more, and you're also self-employed, so you never know when the rug's going to be pulled out from underneath you, there's this compulsion to just make content and content and content and, strike while the iron's hot kind of a thing. And then I think Colleen Balinger also has some issues that led to her having some bad judgment, making some content that was risking harm to children, maybe, and seemingly also did harm some minors, allegedly. So that's a little background on her if you don't know her. So let's get to that video. And then after the video, I thought I would answer some emails to flesh out this episode and make every minute possible for my content provision service to you. All right, let's listen to that episode. Hey, deserving listeners, a lot of you have been asking me to react to Colleen Ballinger's new apology video. I'm curious what she has to say. If you remember, she had a different apology video from a few months ago where she was playing the ukulele. It didn't go over very well with the public. Let's watch.
Hello, everybody. Sorry I've been gone for so long. I've really missed this. I've missed talking to everyone every single day. Obviously, the last video that I posted on here, it's really embarrassing, to say the least. I was being accused of some pretty awful things, and I just was mad, and I should have handled that situation with maturity and empathy, but instead I just let my ego take over, and I'm really disappointed in myself.
These apology videos are usually pretty brief, so often I have to almost read into the things that they're saying because they don't elaborate. Let's go phrase by phrase.
It's really embarrassing, to say the least. I was being accused of some pretty awful things, and I just was mad, and I should have handled that situation with maturity.
Okay, so the first thing that I look for is she sincere? Is there sincerity? That's in the eye of the beholder. None of us can read her mind. Contrary to what body language experts will claim, there is no way to read people's minds or eye movements to detect whether or not someone is telling the truth. So I've been developing this checklist over time because I've watched a lot of public apology videos by this point. So the first thing is, what was the transgression exactly? I always, or frequently, I will go to Reddit and go to the subreddit that is called Out of the Loop. They say Colleen Balinger is known for making goofy videos as Miranda Sings, that's the character, and her channel has millions of followers. She has been popular for years, including having a Netflix show and starring on Broadway. She was even Ariana Grande's vocal coach at one point. Wow, that's interesting. And then going on, a fan named Adam McIntyre claimed that Colleen sent him bra and panties. The same person alleged that Colleen brought up sex multiple times in a group chat with other young fans when he was a teenager by asking if he was a virgin and what his favorite position was. Right, so this is what I remember to be the core of the allegation, and I think there's proof of those exchanges. She made a video in response to all this when she was singing, the one with the ukulele. Some people called it distasteful and gross. So in summary, apparently what the allegations were from the public and from individuals that knew Colleen is that she, as an adult, was grooming kids. The typical clinical definition of grooming in my field is when a perpetrator is recruiting children or victims so that the perpetrator can abuse them. And it typically involves being nice to them, getting close to them, making everyone feel safe around the perpetrator. So is that the allegation that Colleen Balinger was a perpetrator or is a perpetrator? The general gist of the transgression has to do with Colleen Balinger on stage and online during live streams, but also in DMs, was communicating in ways with minors that people would consider to be inappropriate or harmful, or exposing children to things that they shouldn't be exposed to. Also physically, there were allegations that Colleen Balinger, and there's a video of it, Colleen Balinger being physically inappropriate with minors on stage, where there was this one video where one of the kids that she had on stage, and she's a comedian, so the kids are just rolling on the ground laughing, and then she would get volunteers to come up on stage, and one of the kids, I don't know how old the kid was, but clearly a kid, and she had him put cheese balls, like a tin of cheese balls down his pants or something, or down her pants. And then she told the kid to grab out of the tin, but the tin it wasn't like down her pants. It was propped within her pants, I guess. But again, any right-minded entertainer for children would refrain from that stunt. The fact that she was doing that, at the very least, is just bad judgment and raises the risk for harm. I think that's the main thing we need to focus on is harm. The reason why I want to delineate all this is because often in these public apologies, I don't understand why the public is exactly upset. I understand that there's something that was out of the norm, and I hear a lot of people online saying it's inappropriate or it's wrong or it's grooming or whatever. And I'm thinking, okay, what exactly is the harm that happened? Let's really describe it. If the public is up in arms about harm to children, then that makes sense to me.
It's really embarrassing, to say the least. I was being accused of some pretty awful things, and I just was mad, and I should have handled that situation with maturity.
Okay, so we hear her saying that she was accused of something. So she's not saying that she did something. And that sounds like she actually is not admitting that she did anything wrong. So far, all she is apologizing for really is the previous apology video, that it was embarrassing to her.
I should have handled that situation with maturity and empathy, but instead I just let my ego take over, and I'm really disappointed in myself.
Okay, so that's actually pretty good. She's acknowledging, I should have been more empathetic. Do you believe that she's being genuine? Hard to know.
So here's what I want to say today. Over the last 15 years of my career, there have been moments where I was immature and inappropriate with some of my comedy, and there were times when I did not put enough thought into some of my fan interactions.
Okay, so that's acknowledging it, depending on what she's referring to, but I think that's pretty solid acknowledgement that she's saying I was inappropriate with my fans. I think she could really drive it home by identifying an example or by saying I was inappropriate with minors.
Over the last 15 years of my career, there have been moments where I was immature and inappropriate.
Immature and inappropriate. Yeah, those are good descriptors. Again, I'd love it if she gave us an example. I'm guessing she won't.
Some of my comedy, and there were times when I did not put enough thought into some of my fan interactions, and because of that behavior, people got hurt.
That's good. If you believe her, even halfway, then that meets the definition of an apology. That she acknowledges the harm that she caused. She's not blaming it on anybody else, at least in this moment. And she's saying, I was inappropriate and immature with my fans. And she says, I didn't give enough thought to my interactions with fans. Yeah, it's certainly not as descriptive or as harsh as the way everyone else puts it, right? Yeah, she could say something like, I was inappropriate. For example, I sent a pair of I sent a pair of panties and a bra to a minor a fan who was a minor. Now, when you hear that, to me, it sounds worse than it actually was. It's still bad, but what actually happened, and I remember watching the video, she is doing a live stream, and there's a lot of people watching and, chatting, and she was with one of her colleagues, and she was unboxing new clothing items, and she would take out like, ooh, these pants are silly, they look funny, and then she would put them on her head or whatever. And that was part of the charm that people were looking for with her. And within that pile of a lot of different garments, there were unused panties and a bra. On the live stream, she said, okay, who wants, because she was sending these items to her fans. And it seemed that to her fans, it was this wonderful offering because they would be able to have some connection with her, to be sent an actual item from one of the videos, they would frame it or something, which, I get it. I have my parasocial relationships too. And one of the fans said, I want the bra and panties. And she joked around and said, okay, I'll send it to you. That's a lot different than the way it sounded at first to me. It's a lot different than she had her own used panties and bra, and she, as a way of soliciting sex or trying to suggest sex to a biner, she sent her own garments to a fan who was a child. It's a lot different. It's still, as she says, inappropriate. I'm not a huge fan of the word inappropriate because it's not descriptive enough. People use it for all sorts of meanings. The phrase that I would say is that she was doing things that could easily harm children, even though the children wouldn't even necessarily know that they're being harmed or indicate that they're being harmed. This is something that we absolutely understand, that when victims are being harmed, particularly when it comes to sexual exploitation or coercion, the victims often don't know that they're being harmed. Sometimes they have a sense of it, but not always. For example, if you have parents who expose their children to pornography, the children might not feel the harm. They might not go, oh, that hurts, or that was a scary experience, or that damaged me. They probably won't, depending on the circumstances, know that it's happening. But you will see the harm later on in all likelihoods, particularly if it's a pattern and it involves other kinds of experiences, such that you will see the child start to exhibit all sorts of signs of the harm that had been happening to them. Things like being overly sexualized, or being afraid of sex, or believing that they don't deserve sexual boundaries. And there's all sorts of other effects that point to damage that occurred, harm happened to the child. So that's the way I would describe it, is that it's not inappropriate. It's not necessarily grooming, because to me, in my clinical circle, we would use grooming in a different context. What I would say is that it's exposing children, minors, to sexual content that very much risks harming them. That's the way I would describe it.
Where I was immature and inappropriate with some of my comedy, and there were times when I did not put enough thought into some of my fan interactions, and because of that behavior, people got hurt, and I am so sorry.
She says the word, I am so sorry. That is helpful in an apology, but I want to put the notion out there that saying I am sorry or I apologize does not necessarily mean that someone is apologizing. People walk away only knowing that rule oftentimes. And so they will say that, well, I said I was sorry, so why are you still upset at me? And that's all that they said. They said, I am sorry, I apologize. Let's move on in life. And that's not what an apology is. An apology is, it has 11 components. I've already been over all those things in other episodes, but just to go over them again, you need to acknowledge the transgression. I did this. You need to acknowledge the harm. I caused you harm. You need to take responsibility. It was my fault. You need to sincerely express remorse, meaning that you say something like, I feel bad. You need to explain the cause without making excuses. Things like, I have issues with this. Also, you need to provide a plan to address the cause. I will work on those factors that led to that behavior so that I will be less likely to do this in the future. There are other components as well. When I say a component of an effective apology, well, what constitutes an effective apology? Well, the way I define it is that the transgressed upon individual will feel as though the transgressor is genuinely sorry. If I were to hurt my wife's feelings during a conflict or something, and then I apologize, if I apologize such that she actually feels like I'm genuinely remorseful and that I will be trying not to do that again in the future, and I have a plan, I have a logical or a sensible plan about how I can try to reduce that behavior in the future, then I would call that an effective apology. Whereas if I just say I'm sorry or I apologize and that's it, then that's not effective. Plus, you notice when I have the examples here, there's no word sorry or apologize. So with my wife, if I hurt her feelings, I could say, hey, I just want to say that last night when we had our conflict, I feel bad because I harmed you. I'm guessing I hurt your feelings when I was being mean to you, when I said this, this, and this. And I don't really have any excuse. I have a problem with doing that when I get upset. I'm not saying it's an excuse, but I have a tendency to do that sometimes. And my plan is to continue talking about it in therapy and trying to remind myself to remain differentiated, maybe take a break, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you notice, at least I think, I never said I apologize or I'm sorry. And that's the thing I really want to get out there.
And because of that behavior, people got hurt. And I am so sorry. I never wanted to hurt anybody, but it's clear that I did, and I feel so terrible about that. I also feel like there's probably people who are disappointed or feel abandoned.
I always wish that the public figure would elaborate just a little bit. They almost never do. To me, it's like they, in their apology, provide topic sentences without writing the rest of the paragraph, because it's possible that there's a lot there. She says, seemingly in a genuine way, it could be an act, but it looked genuine, who knows, but she says, I never wanted to hurt other people. I did hurt people, but I never wanted to hurt other people. I'm going to assume that that's genuine. There's no reason to believe that she lacks empathy, even though the internet seems to think that half of the world lacks empathy. It's actually a fairly rare condition. You can have empathy that is impaired or eclipsed by defenses or circumstance or culture or something, especially given how much time that she has had to think about it and the consequences that have happened to her. I mean, there was a good couple weeks where seemingly everyone in the English-speaking world hated her. That wouldn't feel very good, right? So I think that she probably genuinely feels sorry, that she's just like, oh, I never wanted to hurt anybody. But where's the rest of the paragraph? Unless she provides it, which I'm guessing she doesn't, I imagine the public just doesn't believe her. But I've heard from professionals who work in PR tell me that your apology should be very brief. And many PR professionals will say, you should never apologize. And so I don't understand. Am I the only one that would, even if I'm not a fan of hers, if she were to provide, like with iDubbbz, for example, I did a reaction video to his apology, and I didn't know him. I only knew him because he was a guest on other YouTube channels that I watched. So when he was apologizing to the public, he was kind of apologizing to me. And to me, I thought his apology felt genuine. It felt like a repair. It felt like he was truly dedicated to trying to make the world a better place, or at the very least not make the world a worse place through his content, like how he thought he evaluated that some of his previous content was harmful to other people, and putting a bad influence out there into the world for his fans to follow in his footsteps. He's like, I don't stand by those behaviors anymore. And the only reason I think that his apology worked on me was because he elaborated. He provided examples.
I also feel like there's probably people who are disappointed or feel abandoned by me because of my silence over the last few months. And I'm so sorry about that as well. I needed to take time to make sure I was listening and learning as much as possible. And I also needed to get the help that I needed to be okay. I'm a mom first and foremost before.
Okay, so she said she got help. What does that mean? Does that mean therapy? And if so, does that mean that she went to a therapist that was conducive to this kind of problem? Because, she could go to therapy and just talk about the weather or something. It would be up to her to say, I have a problem, I have a track record, and I need to work on that.
Get the help that I needed to be okay. I'm a mom first and foremost before anything else. And
then she phrased it, I need the help that I needed to be okay. That seems to imply that she was suffering, which I believe because of the attacks, and she was getting help meaning support, so that she could get through that time, which is totally fine. I would have recommended that she do that. But in addition, is she actually investigating what it is about her that over the span of many years led her to exhibiting behavior that harmed other people, or at least very much risked harm to minors?
And so I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure that I create a positive, kind, inclusive, safe space online with my content. And if you want to be a part of my journey online, I would love to have you. And if not, I completely understand.
Okay, so she just offered a topic sentence for another part of my apologies, which is to offer remedy. I'll make it up to you by, essentially. And she is saying that she's going to make it up to people. I think that's what she's saying. She's going to make it up to people by providing an inclusive, safe, non-harmful place on the internet, that her content is going to be, I guess, more buttoned up or more mature or something. Without elaboration, it's hard to know what she means, though.
I expect anyone to welcome me back with open arms. I don't expect to change anyone's mind with this video. I just wanted to come on here and say that I'm sorry, and I wanted to try to show people that it's possible for someone to grow and learn and be better after making mistakes many, many years ago.
Okay, great, but show us the growth and the change. You had a good start.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to anyone who supported me in any capacity over the last 15 years. I've really, really appreciated it. But yeah, let's get started with the day and see what happens, I guess. I honestly do not know how to transition from this conversation into a vlog, but let's try. Where do I even begin? So much has happened since the last time.
Okay, so it was 3 minutes. I will watch the rest of this, but I probably won't include it in my video. But I'm going to watch the rest of this because maybe there's more apology in here somewhere.
Let's try. Where do I even begin? So much has happened since the last time I vlogged. I mean, if I'm being completely honest, the majority of the last few months has just been spent in therapy. But other than that, the twins just turned 2, which is...
Okay, so she does say therapy. It's hard to know what that means. I'm guessing at the very least it means that she was processing a lot of worry and pain and guilt and anger, all the emotions that you would imagine someone like this going through, probably a lot. So at the very least, I'm guessing there was that. But in therapy, did she spend sufficient time, or will she spend sufficient time investigating the factors that led up to the transgression to begin with? Because it could be quite complicated. I think there were some allegations or speculations that her early childhood could have involved experiences and traumas that could cause her or be a factor in her exhibiting the behavior that she seemingly exhibited, i.e. the boundary crossings with children regarding sexual content. So that would take a long time to work on. So we don't know. We don't know what she's working on at therapy, but at least she's in therapy.
Little lazy spider, and I'm gonna finish cleaning and go to bed. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hopefully I'll see you soon.
All right, so that's that, and let's give her a grade, as I will do. So my public apology grading scale, let's start at the top. So we have A. This is more than sufficient. So this is going way beyond the necessary apology to sincerely demonstrate remorse. No. B is sufficient. So sufficiently met the first 7 components of effective apology. So if we go back up, did she acknowledge the transgression? It was in the ballpark, but it's possible that she didn't, but it looked like she might have if she had elaborated. Number 2, did she acknowledge the harm? I caused you harm. She acknowledged that she caused harm, but she didn't describe the harm. Number 3, take responsibility. It's my fault. Yeah, essentially. But again, without elaboration, it could have all just been words. Sincerely express remorse. I feel bad about. I think so. Number 5, explain the cause without making excuses. Very briefly, she says, I was acting immature or I didn't think things through. Number 6, provide a plan to address the cause. Again, very briefly, she touched on that. And number 7, she offered remedy. Again, very, very briefly. So if I were to say sufficiently met, no, not to me. C, letter grade, mostly sufficient. somewhat met most of the main components of effective apologies. Somewhat met. It fits that. D, slightly sufficient. The average public apology is slightly sufficient. That's what I say. Minimally met some of the requirements. Lacks depth. Lacked demonstrated remorse. I think I would give her a C minus or a D plus. That might sound ridiculous to some that I would say C minus, but compared to other apologies, she actually is a lot better than a lot of other public apologies. And the typical public apology is a D. And I would say that her apology was better than, just slightly better than the typical. So proof's in the pudding moving forward, we don't know. D plus, because it's really hard to know if she actually does recognize the harm. And you think, okay, so here's the thing. If you really did, and to me, if you really recognized and acknowledged the harm that you caused and or risked to all the fans and to the children and other people involved, your employees, if you really acknowledged it and really felt it and really felt the remorse and the sorrow, that's what sorry comes from. It comes from feeling sorrow, feeling sad, feeling empathy of like, oh, I harmed. If you really felt that, you think that the apology would be way more elaborate. In fact, research shows that when transgressions are bigger, apologies need to be bigger. Like, I always give the example of I'm in the grocery store and I have my cart and I accidentally run into someone. I don't need to apologize for 5 hours, and I don't even necessarily need to have all the 11 components, right? All I probably need to do is say like, oh my God, I didn't see you. I'm so sorry. Or, oh, are you okay? So that might be all I need to say. Or I might even just be like, I just say a word and look at them like, oh, exhibiting like I didn't mean to. And I'm sorry, are you okay? Just with my face. I might not even need to say anything. So very small transgressions to the transgressed upon person require very limited apology time and effort and elaboration. Whereas the transgression that she committed, especially when you think about, I think, millions of people that have been transgressed upon potentially, then you would just imagine that the apology would be a lot more elaborate. I can't imagine if I were in her shoes that my conscience would be cleared. So I would say that D plus, which is not great, but better than most, which is a sad state of affairs. Okay, so that's the end of the audio version of the video I posted a couple weeks ago. It's me again from the intro, if that makes any sense to you. Let's take a break, and when we get back, I'll answer some emails. All right, back from the break. So this email is from Middle Tier Patron. She's anonymous Middle Tier Patron. She says, "Hi, Dr. Kirk. You and your mom are such an amazing attachment example. I envy the lovely attachment you have with her. You are teaching me a lot about healthy relationships. My mother was a well-meaning caregiver who provided me with food and all the essentials, but I was born a year and a half after triplets. Plus, there were 2 kiddos before them, and I didn't nearly get the full attention I needed during my early years. My parents had 7 kids within 8 years. To this day, I don't feel close to my mom or my dad. They are aging, and I want a connection with them, but it's not there. The other siblings have something with them, but I don't seem to have it. Even my baby brother, who is younger than me, seems to have something with them, and he was 2 years after me. Can you relate this at all to attachment theory? It seems like it fits to me." End of email. Yeah, attachment theory is absolutely involved in this, in that it's hard to know, but it's absolutely possible that because your parents already had they had 5 kids before you, 5 young kids. So if I'm understanding the years right, they probably had when you were born, they had triplets who were 18 months old when you were born, And then older than them would have been maybe like a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old or something like that. So just imagine that. You got a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old, and then 3 18-month-old children and a newborn. So that's going to stretch you pretty thin, right? And absolutely what that can result in is a lack of attunement, which can result in feeling longing for a connection that doesn't seem to be there. So yeah, that's just right down the middle of attachment theory. But I want to caution you when you draw conclusions about your other siblings and their connection to your parents. It's possible that you have been elected by the family system to actually feel the disconnection that a lot of kids feel. I don't know. It's possible that you just, it does stand to reason, I suppose, that you experience kind of the worst case scenario, because the oldest two kids would have had a lot more attention and attunement potentially from the parents. The triplets probably, as a joint effort, the parents could give them a lot of attention. Probably less attention than they were able to give the older siblings, but maybe enough. And then you come around, and if you have 3 18-month-old children that are mobile and starting to get into stuff and starting to demand things and want things and need things and grab for things and fight with each other and da-da-da, then you could say that you were in the worst position. And then your younger sibling, your baby brother, maybe the parents had overcome some of that stress. The triplets were old enough that they could play quietly by themselves occasionally, such that you were the only one that they had to really kind of focus on, and while they were nursing and raising a newborn. So it stands to reason. It's hard to know. There's no research on this configuration specifically, but it's possible. But another possibility is that you actually are in a family with a lot of distance and a lot of feelings about the lack of attunement, and either your siblings don't know or identify with it, or they don't want to talk about it. I've talked with a lot of people, not only clients, but also students, because we run students through a similar discovery process. And what I will hear a lot from a certain percentage of people is that they will have this narrative of like, everyone else seems to be connected except for me. And then when they actually investigate, they find that no one's connected. In fact, some of those individuals that thought they were the least connected were actually the most connected. So, and the others were so much disconnected that they didn't even allow themselves to acknowledge that they were disconnected. So it's hard to know. But if your other siblings do in fact feel that connection, and there is a real connection there greater than yours, it's possible that, you just got the worst of the birth order situation. That happens sometimes. All right, this next email is from anonymous middle tier patron. She says, "You frequently apologize for your tangents." So just chiming in here. I don't know if I've apologized so much on the audio podcast. I know that I have, but most of the time I'm apologizing in my videos, my reaction videos on YouTube. And it's because sometimes I will be criticized for not going faster through the episodes that I'm watching and reacting to. And people are wanting to get to that story beat and are upset at me for not getting there faster. And so I will apologize because I can, I'm a talker. And so I'm going to yammer about things for better, for worse. And to tell you the truth, I often will cut out a lot of my yammerings, which, says something about my yammering, since the edited version, there's still a lot of yammerings, right? And I got a particularly good dose of people yelling at me during Love is Blind, the season 5 that was a couple months ago. I was watching this scene with, if you're familiar with, what was their names? I've already forgotten their names. It was the firefighter guy who wore all the flags, if you're familiar. Anyway, and I apparently was just about to see a scene between the couple that was particularly infamous, and I was yammering, which meant that people were watching the episode thinking I was going to get to that story beat, but I didn't, and then they'd have to wait until the next day or maybe even the next day to see me react to it. And there were a lot of people in the comment section that were yelling at me, and it's one thing to yell at me, but it's another thing when there's a lot of upvotes, which indicates that there's like a whole crowd of people that are yelling at me, you know? And that did not feel good because, you know, I turn on the microphone, I turn on the camera, and presumably that's my whole thing, is that I talk. And when I get yelled at for talking, it's hurtful. And I also don't like it about myself. I don't like to bore anybody. You know, like in my personal life, I actually don't talk that much because you all give me a chance to get it off my chest here. So it was hurtful, and so I started probably apologizing more often. And you know, it's a thing. I understand, and there's a balance between yammering and being concise, and I'm always trying to ride that line. And it's not as if feedback about my yammering and tangents are wrong. There's a balance, and there's also a bell curve regarding what the audience is looking for. Some people are looking for very concise things, and some people are actually upset that we don't yammer more or have more tangents, or I don't have more content. So, you know, I'm trying to please a wide variety of people. But anyway, so Nana submitted to your Patron. She says, you frequently apologize for your tangents, and I wanted to remind you that your tangents are actually very useful. Obviously, they often significantly enrich the information that you're presenting. And just chiming in here, yeah, when I started to apologize more in reaction to my hurt feelings, there were a lot of really kind comments on YouTube and otherwise, you know, emails saying that, you know, they're like, you know, they were basically saying that they've never been critical about my yammering. They will say that that's exactly why they watch the channel, and if anyone has a problem with the yammering, then they're not true fans, or they're not watching the right channel. You know, that's kind of the feeling I got too. I'm like, that's my whole thing, is I watch a clip and then I talk about it, and sometimes it's a short thing and sometimes it's a long thing that I say. The other thing I was thinking with this is just my defensiveness, right or wrong, but people were yelling at me, and I'm thinking, well, you saw the scene already, so you're just waiting for me to see the scene. And you understand, I haven't, you know, and also some people yell at me because I don't know things that have already happened. You know, they'll just be like, how do you possibly have a positive spin on this person when they did this and this and this? And I'm like, well, that happens in the future, so I haven't seen that. Anyway, it's just, but like I said, there's, you know, like there were criticisms about Umberto and I yammering at the beginning of the deep dive that we did on, was it the Duggars, I believe? There was some tangents that we went down. Oh, no, it wasn't the Duggars. It was a more recent one. Anyway, point is that we had some early tangents that were, you know, it took us a while to get to the gist of the story is the thing. and I got that, and I, you know, I hear that, and I incorporate that sort of stuff. And some of the feedback was fine, but some of it's hurtful. You know, there's a way to give feedback. You know, if we were in person, I would see that you were bored and I would adjust. As a professor, that would happen. I would notice glazed eyes and people not very engaged, falling asleep, and I'd say, okay, obviously there's something about what I'm doing right now is not engaging. I don't have that benefit. I'm recording and then putting it out there. So I have to iterate my approach piece by piece later. You know what I mean? Anyway, getting back to the email. Obviously, your tangents significantly enrich the information you're presenting. But also, personally, I find that the way the so-called irrelevant tangents are actually helpful in that it slows down the pace, which is actually really useful to me because of the potentially triggering nature of many topics that you discuss. There's lots about the podcast I would miss if you felt like you needed to make it shorter. So the apologies are really unnecessary from my point of view. End of email. Well, anonymous middle tier patron, that's very kind of you. Yeah, and a lot of people were saying that's like, that's why we come here, just because we want you to comment on these things. And I'll also say that I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to probably an average of, 3-4 hours of podcasts a day. I'm doing chores, or I'm driving somewhere, or sometimes I'll be playing a video game and I'll just listen to podcasts. So, I spend a lot of time listening to podcasts, and also I watch a lot of YouTube videos, long form YouTube videos. And there are times when I will be listening to something or watching something, and I'll be thinking there are too many tangents, or they're yammering too much, or they're not getting to the point the point quick enough. And it's always been something that I've been concerned about. I don't know if y'all know this. I've talked about this before, but my episodes, where they're video or audio, I launch into the topic as soon as I can, because I hate podcasts and YouTube videos that have an intro that I'm not interested in, even from content providers that I'm a fan of. It's like when you click on something, you want to start in on the stuff. You don't want to have, like, it's like that experience when you sit down to watch a movie on Netflix or something. They have all those introductory graphics, like produced by these people in association with these other people. And then you think, okay, now the movie's going to start. And then, nope, it's not the movie. There's like a bit on The Simpsons, I think, about this. But anyway, it's stuff like that. It's just like, I'm a very impatient person, as you can tell. And so I'm always like, get to the point, And so, yeah, I've always been very obsessed with trying to be snappy and quick and relevant and engaging and non-boring. And I do a lot of editing. I do a lot of thinking. When I work out my outlines, I have every, story beat, and sometimes I have tangents kind of worked in. Sometimes tangents just seem natural. It's a very high priority to me. I was a guest on a podcast a while back, and they did not have that skill or that priority or something. And I was so bored I was on the podcast. I was in, talking with the hosts of this podcast, and I was so bored. And I thought, I can't imagine what it would be like to listen to this episode. I mean, God bless them. Maybe they have a lot of fans, but to my preferences, it'll drive me nuts. So I'm thinking about it. If you are one of those people that doesn't like the tangents or wants it to be more concise, I'm doing a lot to get there. It would be much worse if I didn't prioritize that or I didn't edit stuff out. All right, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. This email is from middle tier patron and YouTube member Bob from Minneapolis. She says, since the pandemic and after losing a close family member, sorry to hear that, I've noticed that I am diving headfirst into an existential crisis, and I'm questioning the meaning of life, and I'm thinking about death myself as well. I'm 35, and right now my biggest fear is my eventual death. I find myself having panic attacks at the thought of death. I just want to stop time and hold on to every precious moment. I feel like this fear of death might be nagging at society after the pandemic. You have mentioned before that you had come to terms with your mortality. Can you share any advice on how to move through this? As a side note, I am a clinician and I have my own therapist. However, my therapist specializes in trauma, not on my own mortality. I'm also an atheist or agnostic, so I cannot rely on spirituality to move through this. End of email. Yeah, I've talked about this a lot before, but briefly, is that for those of you who don't relate to this email, God bless you. For those who do, you know exactly what Bob is talking about. What Bob is talking about is right up my alley. Bob from Minneapolis. I can absolutely relate to what you're talking about. And it's not just death anxiety. It's not just worries about death. It's worries about annihilation and the abyss. Death is one thing, but being erased from existence is a completely different thing. And it is truly terrifying. It can't be any other way. The only way it isn't, if you're not terrified of it, dear listener, again, I wish I was you, then it typically either you don't really think about it much, or you're in denial of it. And those aren't the same thing. You can acknowledge the reality of death and potential annihilation, and also just not really be oriented towards that future. That's not being in denial. But there are people who are existentially terrified of it, but they're in denial of it, and they actively will. I mean, I think that's a big reason why we avoid everything related to death in general in our society. Oh, it's so morbid. Why are you talking about that? I've been told that by many people in my life. They'll just be like, God, that's so morbid. Like, I don't know if I said this on the podcast, but Kirk Cousins, a quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings, he was on this documentary kind of thing, being interviewed or something. And I actually didn't even watch the episode. I heard about it through someone else, but I heard that Kirk Cousins, he has this container with all these rocks. He has a rock for every month that is likely left in his life. Given life expectancy, he has a bunch of rocks in this vessel, each representing a month of his future life. And then every month he pulls out this rock, and I think he holds on to it for the month. And then at the end of the month, he puts it in this other container where his spent months go. And I like this idea so much because it's completely how I'm oriented normally anyway, and have been since I was a teenager, that I decided to do it. Stacy and I are taking this pottery class, and at first I thought that I wouldn't like pottery, but I'm really getting into it now, ceramics. I'm terrible, but it's fun to explore and create and stuff. And it's kind of a date for Stacy and I. It's a whole production that we do together, and then we go to lunch afterwards and anyway. But I took two bowls that I had made, and I got all these little polished rocks. I've always loved, when I was a kid, I used to collect polished rocks. It's just so funny because I see kids today who have polished rocks, and they'll have their own tumbler, and they will have like just bags and bags of polished rocks. When in the early 70s, when I was quote unquote collecting polished rocks, I'm not even joking, I probably had like 9 polished rocks total, and no access to any more, and no aspirations or hopes or dreams of acquiring any more than maybe if we passed by. There was this one store that sold polished rocks in the mountains east of Seattle, and I just thought maybe one day we'll pass by that store and we'll stop in, and I'll buy 1 or 2 more. But anyway, I now can buy just bags and bags of polished rocks online, and so I bought all these little. They're about the size of like a jelly bean, and I counted out. My life expectancy is 78, given Asian American, and so that was 25 years actually, because I'm almost 53. And I should be 53 by the time this episode comes out. Point is that I counted out 25 years, which turned out to be, I think, 200, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, some even amount, and I put those in one bowl, and then every month I don't carry the rock around with me, but I just take one rock out and I put it in the other bowl. And I think so far there's like 3 months that I've spent. I even thought about getting all the polished rocks for all the months I've actually been alive up until this point, so you could actually see the contrast. For some people that I've told this to, they'll say that's morbid, and they're like, why would you want to think about that? It's so depressing. And so I think for some people, they go into denial. I think for other people, they have religion, of course. They have the afterlife or some version of it. They're like, well, I don't know if I believe in heaven per se, but there's got to be something after this. There's got to be, maybe it's something we can't even comprehend, like we become energy or something. People have those kind of thoughts, and those can be very comforting when you are faced with non-existence, right? Especially with people who have already died. And I'll hold that there are some people who are truly just so enlightened and so much of the Buddha that they are completely okay with the reality of non-existence. I can't relate to that personally, but so there's a variety of different approaches or ways of dealing with this thing that we all have to. There's two things that are universal and for sure and certain, and that is death and taxes, as they say. And so we're all going to have to face it, and we all know we have to face it, and we all have to have a way of dealing with that facing. And so for me, and for you, Bob, in Minneapolis and many others, at least you start off with what you're experiencing, which is this just panic of, so I have limited time. It might be a long time. It might be 50 years. You're 35. Maybe you have 50 years left, maybe more. That's a lot of years, but it's finite, and it will run out. And as we get older, time goes by faster and faster and faster. And you're halfway to the finish line is really more like you're 2/3 of the finish line in terms of how you process time, seemingly. And so it's awful to think that for us and everyone else, it's just like lights out, you're done, if that's what you believe. And so how do you deal with that? What do you do? When the thought occurs to you, it could be demoralizing, it can be terrifying, it can be, for me, it's those, but it's also a strange feeling of that I can't even describe. It's like this fundamental emotion or vibe that is pre-verbal that I'm pretty sure I must have experienced when I was when I was an infant and wasn't able to process things verbally in my head yet. It's a very unnerving feeling, and yet today I am not in a state of panic like I was before. And I'm just one person, but the way that I've dealt with it is to face it, one, to not turn away from it, because that just causes for me more suffering or just kicks it down the road. I've also found that by talking about it, it helps, and finding other people. There were two noticeable moments for me. And there were many moments of talking and thinking. Making the podcast is actually a part of that. I recognize that I'll be dead, and I wanted something to live on. I wanted there to be evidence of my existence. And of course, it's narcissistic to think about that, but also it's stupid because in, I don't know how many years, there won't be podcasts anymore. There won't be ways of accessing this sort of stuff after my death, so it's not like I'll live forever, and who knows if anyone will even care, but it does, it feels better to feel like, well, there's some meaning here. And if 5 years after my death, someone comes across a random episode of mine and it helps them, then, that gives meaning to the time that I was here. So for me, there's been a lot of things, but there were two noticeable moments. There was one episode of This American Life many years ago, and Ira Glass, the host, if you're familiar, he, I believe, from my memory, talked about his own death anxiety or existential anxiety regarding non-existence. From my memory, he talked about how, for him, when his head hit the pillow, that's when all these thoughts would rush into his head. And that's the same for me. When my head hits the pillow, that's when all these thoughts start to emerge. And he described it so well, and it really helped me, because for the first time I'd heard someone describe what I thought was perhaps a unique neurosis of mine. And that's a weird thing for us humans, that through suffering together, we feel better, strangely. Another, and it feels normalizing, that kind of thing. But the biggest moment actually for me was I came across a phenomenological psychological study about existential panic. And the reason why I came across it was because when I was working on my own or developing my own research project, I landed on a method called phenomenological research, which I won't bore you with the details, but it's a form of how humans discover things, and a form of inquiry, if you will. And I was looking for examples of how to write the report because there weren't a lot of examples out there. I didn't know how I was supposed to format the report after I conduct the research. And so I was looking at various different examples, and I came across one, my dogs are barking, that was on death anxiety or existential dread. And I was reading through it just to get an idea of how these reports are written, but I became completely engrossed in the findings and what the participants were saying. And the way that you typically will write a phenomenological report is you interview a small set of people, like 10 people typically, depending on what you're looking into. And then you pull quotes in the report as you report themes and what people are talking about. There's various different ways of looking at it, but it goes deep. Phenomenological research, the benefit of it is it goes deep. On the opposite end of the spectrum with research is you can do a survey where you survey 10,000 people. You can get a lot of mathematical power through doing research studies like that and find very small differences between two groups of people. But you're not going very deep. You have to ask a fairly simple question like, how tall are you? Or do you like ice cream? Whereas with phenomenological research, you will have, say, 10 participants, but you interview them for hours potentially, and you as the researcher become extremely familiar with every single word in every interview. You conduct the interviews, you record the interviews, you transcribe the interviews, you analyze the interviews, you code the interviews, you look at the interviews, you process the interviews, you put aside your assumptions about what they're saying, and you get really deep into what these 10 people are saying. And the benefit is that you can go really deep. And so as this report is telling me what the researcher found, it was very deep and very rich and very helpful to me because something turned in my soul. I remember feeling it almost physically, that something had shifted in me from being mostly terrified and occasionally soothed to being very much mostly soothed and just a little terrified. It was weird, and I'm sure that report won't have that effect on many others. If not, that report wouldn't affect anyone in the way that it affected me. And I've talked about this report before, and people have asked me for a copy of it, and believe me, I have looked. It's almost as if there is a God, that God sent that report just to me to help me. I've looked far and wide, and dear listener, if you know how to look for these kinds of things, phenomenological research report, death anxiety, that's all that I remember. And it would have come out, I would have read it around 2012-ish, and so 2013 maybe, so it would have to be a study that was published before that date. But anyway, that report helped me, and I think what it did was it was an in-depth look at others who were having the same feeling I was, and also the themes that they found were very helpful. Like, I don't remember exactly the themes, but I think the themes were things like, I thought I was alone, or I didn't know anyone else had these feelings, or it just feels good. Because sometimes when you're interviewing people in these research studies, they will find that as they are talking about it, they will tell the researcher, it actually feels good to talk about this. And some people were, it's like, I think people are, anyway, point is that that's for me. And now that doesn't tell you all that I have done since I was about 15 years old to wrestle with what I have wrestled with. So it's not as if those two things happen and everything was fine. It's a constant thing, Another part of it is that when I feel disconnected from people, when I'm lonely, I have more existential dread. And it is found that for people who were neglected, they generally have a higher likelihood of having anxiety in general, including death anxiety. So the closer I get to other people, the more emotional closeness and attachment vulnerability I have with others, generally speaking, the less dread of any kind that I have, including existential dread. Another thing that research has found is that, and I can attest to this, is that when people are in the flow of the meaning of their life, then they're much less likely to be anxious and much less likely to have existential dread. When I have had moments in my life where I don't know where I'm headed, or I don't feel like I'm living my life's purpose, or I don't even know what my life's purpose is, I'm much more prone to that death anxiety. Whereas when I feel like I'm in the flow of my life and I'm doing what I want, and I feel like I'm, satisfying or in the process of satisfying my life's mission, whatever that is. And for me, it's trying to make the world a better place, trying to have happiness in my life, trying to give to others, trying to experience things with other people. Then when I'm in that flow, then the death anxiety doesn't have any room to creep in. One way to think about it is that existential anxiety is just a sign of something else that's happening in our lives. It's not the death anxiety that is the problem. It's some other problem that manifests as death anxiety. Having said that, I don't want to diminish the existential anxiety. A lot of, you, Bob, you say you're in therapy, but you're a clinician yourself, but your therapist, although she specializes in trauma, which sounds like that's helping you, you say that she doesn't specialize in fear of your own mortality. And I found that to be true too. When I talk with therapists, my own therapist, about this, I've had a wide variety of responses, some of which are very dismissive of it. They will say, "Oh, death anxiety. Well, let's work on the cognitions or something." And it's just like, no, this isn't like a phobia. This is a recognition of reality. This is something that is going to happen for all of us, and there's no way around it. There's the only way with it, I guess, is to be with it, and the only way to be with it is to acknowledge it and to feel the terror and the disappointment. And I love all the responses I get from people. Some of you might have already been emailing me or commenting below. You'll have these I've heard it all. People will say like, "Well, Kirk, there was a time when you didn't exist and before you were born, so that wasn't a bad thing. So, you're just going to return to that." Newsflash, that doesn't comfort me in the least. In fact, that adds another anxiety, because what if, in the grand scheme of the universe, however these things work, I was never chosen to become conscious? What if I stayed in the abyss, so to speak, forever? What if I never actually emerged? What about those quote unquote beings that have never come into existence and never will? Of course, they aren't in existence, because they don't exist. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it's, and plus that's in the past. Yeah, sure. Okay. I didn't exist, but I didn't know I didn't exist. Now I know what existence feels like. I don't want to give it up. It doesn't help. Another thing people will say is they'll just say like, "Well, you just got to live life to its fullest, and, one day you'll be dead." Or some people will say, "Well, if you die quietly, then it doesn't hurt." They think that what I'm afraid of is the pain of dying or something. And certainly, it's not super pleasant, but that's the fear of that is nothing compared to the non-existence of myself. Like, I'd rather be in existence and be uncomfortable and occasionally in pain than to just no longer exist at all, at least I think. Anyway, it's there. So my point is that if you don't get it, then God bless you. I am very, very happy for you. There are some people that are just content with no longer exist. If they believe, if you truly believe that there's no afterlife, then there is that there are some people who are just truly just content and they're cool with it. And, but don't talk to people like us as if we're stupid for acknowledging a thing that an entire branch of philosophy is centered around. It's not like all those geniuses in Europe that were, Kierkegaard and all those others. It's not like they were stupid and that all they needed to do was talk to your stoner brother who says that like life is a circle or something. You know what I mean? It's a well understood phenomenon of human struggle is the existence of existential anxiety. An entire branch of therapy is based on this notion. So, you know, there's no quick fix to that. So yeah, Bob, I don't know if that helps what I'm saying, but that's what I said. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.